My name is Adrian Walker. I'm 45 years old, and what my brothers didn't know was that I had always been 3 steps ahead of their greed, waiting for the exact moment to leave them with nothing. While they were already dividing the money from the sale of my father's house and toasting with a wine they couldn't afford, I was holding in my hand the document that would turn them into strangers under the law and beggars in reality. Watching your own blood smile at you while stabbing you in the back is a feeling that freezes the soul, but what they felt when the cold truth hit them head-on was far worse. Nothing compares to the silence that falls over a room when the person you thought was the family fool turns out to be the one holding the key to your cell. They looked at me with contempt, called me selfish, and tried to trample on the memory of a dead man for a handful of bills, never suspecting that every move they made had been recorded, analyzed, and invalidated before they could even sign a single paper. Betrayal is a dish cooked slowly, and my brothers were burned by their own fire. If you like stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave a like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. For years, our family was the perfect example of superficial stability. My father was a man of rigid principles, an entrepreneur who built his fortune from absolute nothing, hauling boxes under the sun until he managed to found his own construction materials distribution company. I was always by his side. Unlike my brothers Stephen and Julian, I never saw the business as an ATM, but as the legacy of a man who had worn his health down so that we would never lack anything. From my early 20s, I spent my days surrounded by inventories, balance sheets, and freight trucks. I knew every corner of the warehouses, every supplier by name, and every accounting trick my father used to keep the ship afloat during hard times. My relationship with him was built on few words, but absolute loyalty. We understood each other through a glance, through a shared silence over a cup of coffee at 5 in the morning before the rest of the world woke up. He trusted me because he knew my ambition wasn't fast money, but the permanence of what he had built. My brothers were different. Stephen, the oldest, always felt entitled to everything simply because he had been born first. He was a man of expensive suits, bought with the money from bonuses my father handed him. Yet he never knew what it meant to negotiate a real contract or deal with a transportation strike. He moved in social circles that didn't belong to us, pretending to have a sophistication that collapsed the moment he opened his mouth to talk business. Julian, on the other hand, was the favorite, the youngest. The one who always found an excuse to skip board meetings because he was busy spending his allowance on trips and unnecessary luxuries. To them, the company was an endless source of resources that I managed for their benefit. They saw me as the boring brother, the one who stayed late at work while they enjoyed life. They never cared to learn the trade. All they cared about was how much would be deposited into their accounts at the end of each month. The balance held as long as my father was present. He was the glue keeping together the pieces of a structure that was already cracking. I knew they envied me, not for my money, but for the closeness I had with the old man. They saw our bond as a threat to their future interests. When my father's health began to decline, that envy turned into something darker. They started showing up at the office more often, not to work, but to watch, to ask uncomfortable questions about properties and overseas accounts. I observed them in silence, watching their eyes light up every time the doctor delivered bad news. It was disgusting to see them calculating the value of furniture while our father was still breathing in the room next door. At that time, I was 45 years old, with a life almost entirely devoted to duty. My emotional state was one of vigilant calm. I knew a storm was coming, but I trusted that the natural justice of things would put everyone in their place. I wasn't looking for conflict. I only wanted the transition to be fair. I handled the medical care, the hospital bills, and kept the company running despite the emotional chaos. Stephen and Julian, meanwhile, were already consulting lawyers behind my back, searching for legal loopholes to invalidate any decision my father might have made in my favor. They felt clever. They felt powerful, because they believed my silence was submission. What they didn't understand was that silence is the favorite tool of those who truly hold control. Any of you could see yourselves in this position. You work hard, take care of your family, respect the rules, and assume others will do the same, especially when they are your own blood. You trust that blood ties mean something, that there is a moral line no one would dare cross. You wake up every day doing the right thing, building on foundations of honesty, while others in the shadows are digging a pit for you to fall into. It's a false sense of security we've all felt at some point, the belief that good is always rewarded and that betrayal only happens in movies. But reality is far more cynical. The truth is that sometimes the people sitting at your Christmas table are the very ones sharpening the knives to take what belongs to you. I was that man, the loyal brother, the devoted son, the pillar of the structure, walking straight into an ambush my own brothers had prepared with surgical precision, unaware that I had already seen their shadows move long before they took their first step. On the day of the funeral, there were no sincere tears from them, only a poorly disguised impatience hanging in the air like poisonous gas. Barely a week after we buried my father, Stephen and Julian called for a meeting at the company's headquarters. They didn't invite me. They notified me. When I arrived, they were seated at my father's oak table, surrounded by folders and accompanied by a lawyer with a plastic smile I had never seen in the company before. The atmosphere was icy. Stephen didn't even look me in the eye as he drummed his fingers on the table, wearing a gold watch he had stolen from the old man's nightstand just hours after his death. Without any preamble, the lawyer dropped the bomb. They presented a will that my father had supposedly signed in his final days, when morphine and confusion had already clouded his judgment. According to that document, the company and the main properties were transferred to a holding controlled by the two of them. I was left with a small, crumbling rural property and a sum of money that didn't even cover 10% of what I was legally entitled to after decades of work. They looked at me with a mix of triumph and disgust. Julian leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said a line that still echoes in my ears. "Be grateful we left you something, Adrian. You were always just an employee with privileges. It's time for the real owners to take control." I felt a pressure in my chest, a dull rage rising up my throat, but I didn't explode. I stood still, watching them spread maps and bank statements across the desk where I had spent countless nights saving the family's assets. It was a humiliation designed to break me, to remind me that despite all my effort, they still saw me as the lesser brother, the one who gets his hands dirty. I tried to reason with them. I spoke about my father's true intentions, about documents I had personally helped draft years earlier, but they cut me off immediately. Stephen stood up, stepped into my personal space, and placed a hand on my shoulder with unbearable condescension. He told me that if I tried to contest anything, they would bury me in lawsuits that would last decades, and I would end up on the street. That very afternoon, I realized the betrayal was total. They had changed the locks on the office and instructed the security guards not to let me in. My belongings, photos of my father, my personal records, everything was packed into cardboard boxes on the sidewalk under a light rain that had begun to soak it all. I stood there in front of the building I had helped build, watching my entire life being discarded like trash. There were no screams, no pleas, just absolute silence as I loaded those boxes into my car. In less than 8 hours, they had expelled me from my home, my job, and my own family history. The loss was complete. It wasn't just the money or the bricks, it was the stripping away of my identity. In the family WhatsApp group, Julian wrote that I had decided to step away due to stress and that they would be taking over the legacy. They blocked me from all shared accounts and sent emails to suppliers stating that I no longer had legal authority to negotiate anything. They left me in absolute emptiness, believing that a man alone without the backing of a large structure was nothing. They underestimated me deeply. They thought my calm was defeat, when in reality, as I drove away, my mind was already processing every mistake they had made in their rush to steal from me. They believed they had taken the crown, but they didn't know I had walked away with the keys to the kingdom. I settled into a small apartment, far from the clumsy luxury they were now flaunting. During the first few weeks, silence was my only companion. I didn't seek immediate revenge. Impulsive anger is the amateur's mistake. I needed precision. I knew something they, in their arrogance, had overlooked. My father was not a careless man. Months before he fell ill, he had begun to suspect Stephen and Julian's moves. One night at the office, he handed me a small key and an address. telling me to use it only if the wolves started to howl. I contacted an old ally, Dr. Michael Reynolds, a lawyer who had retired years earlier and was the only person my father fully trusted. We met in an anonymous coffee shop. Reynolds wasn't surprised when he heard my story. When we opened the safety deposit box that matched the key, we found the real power. Not just a later will properly notarized in another jurisdiction, but a series of parallel accounting records my father had kept as a form of life insurance. It turned out that my brothers, in their hunger for fast money, had been diverting company funds into shell accounts long before my father passed away. They had committed tax fraud and money laundering, leaving trails that only someone who truly knew the company's internal operations, like me, could connect. My plan wasn't just to reclaim my share, it was to suffocate them with their own greed. With Reynolds' help and a forensic accounting expert who worked quietly in the shadows, we assembled an airtight legal puzzle. I spent months collecting signatures, testimonies from employees they had unjustly fired, and documents proving that the will they presented was a crude forgery. I moved with the patience of a hunter. I watched them from afar through financial reports. I knew they were bleeding the company dry, making disastrous decisions and wasting capital on absurd investments. I let them do it. I let them sink deeper into the mud, allowing them to sign compromising contracts that legally tied them to the accounting irregularities. Every document they signed was another nail in their coffin. While they celebrated their false victory, I prepared the final blow, waiting for the exact moment when they would be most exposed, when they believed no one could touch them anymore. My counterattack wouldn't be a shouting match, but an administrative and legal collapse they would have no escape from. The day chosen for the end was the annual meeting of shareholders and creditors. They had called the meeting to announce the sale of one of the company's main plants, a desperate move to cover the financial holes their excesses had created. Stephen presided over the table with false confidence, wearing a suit that screamed arrogance, while Julian joked with investors in a corner. When I walked into the room, silence took over. They looked at me with a mix of surprise and mockery. Stephen stood up, pointing at the door, ready to order my removal, but before he could open his mouth, Dr. Michael Reynolds entered behind me, accompanied by 2 district attorney officers and a forensic accounting expert. There was no need to raise my voice. I sat at the opposite end of the table, placed a black folder in front of me, and looked at them with the cold focus of someone observing a laboratory experiment. Reynolds proceeded to present the real will, properly registered and validated, which not only named me the universal heir of the majority shareholding, but also included an automatic disinheritance clause for any child found guilty of fraudulent management. Stephen's face went from red to pale in seconds. His hands began to shake as he tried to flip through the documents the prosecutor placed in front of him. What they didn't know was that while they were busy draining the accounts, I had quietly purchased the company's debts through an external holding entity. I wasn't just the owner by inheritance, I was also its main creditor. I had the legal power to declare a technical bankruptcy and demand the immediate liquidation of their personal assets to cover the deficit. Julian tried to stammer an apology, attempting to appeal to our brotherhood, but I cut him off with a single look. There were no brothers in that room, only a con man and the man who had caught him. Justice was surgical. In front of the very investors they were trying to deceive, the money laundering scheme and the forgery of the previous will were exposed. The officers formally notified them of the immediate opening of criminal proceedings. I watched as the confidence they flaunted collapsed like a house of cards. Stephen tried to shout, called me a traitor, accused me of having planned this from the very beginning. I smiled faintly, with bitter irony. He was right about one thing. I had planned it, but only because they forced me to when they tried to steal the work of our father's entire lifetime. By the end of the afternoon, I watched them leave the building not as owners, but as defendants, escorted away to give their statements. Their accounts were frozen, and their luxury cars, bought with stolen money, remained in the parking lot because they no longer had the right to use them. I stayed alone in my father's office, feeling the weight of the silence. There was no joy, only the cold satisfaction of having restored order. They had tried to leave me with nothing, and ended up handing me the tools to erase them from this family's history. Revenge wasn't an explosion, It was a perfectly calculated settling of accounts. Months have passed since that day in the boardroom, and calm has returned to the company's hallways, though it is a different kind of calm, heavier somehow. Stephen and Julian lost everything. Not just the shares and the properties, but also their reputation and their freedom of movement. They are now facing legal proceedings that will drain the few resources they have left, and the last I heard, they blame each other at every hearing, destroying whatever remained of their bond. They've sent me messages, tried to use uncles and cousins to appeal to my compassion, but my response is always silence. Betrayal is not an error in judgment, it is a conscious decision, and anyone who chooses to break the bond of blood must be prepared to bleed alone. I have returned to sit at my father's desk, not out of ambition, but out of respect. The company is healing. The employees who were mistreated have come back, and the accounts are once again in order. Sometimes, in the solitude of this office, I ask myself if all this effort was worth it. The answer is always the same. Justice is not about feeling good. It is about putting everything back in its place. There are no happy endings in this story, because a broken family cannot be repaired with money or court rulings. There are scars that never close, but I would rather carry the scar of a warrior than the mark of a victim. I have learned that loyalty is a concept many people confuse with weakness. My brothers thought that because I was the man who worked in silence, I had no claws. They forgot that the most dangerous predator is the one who doesn't need to roar to prove its power. Now, when I walk through the warehouses and hear the engines of the trucks, I know my father's legacy is safe, not because I am a saint, but because I was cold enough to protect it from those who should have loved it. Life has a very particular way of balancing the scales. There is no need to shout, to fight, or to lower yourself to the level of those who hurt you. All it takes is patience, intelligence, and the unbreakable will not to be trampled. I look at my father's photos and feel that, at last, he can rest in peace. The debt has been settled, and the family name, though stained by them, has been reclaimed by my hand. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories.